Hello and welcome to the Plant Paradigm Podcast, where we have inspiring conversations with amazing individuals from all across the world and look for ways to create a clean, green, and sustainable future for us, the planet, and all beings. I'm your host, Tom Simak, a fellow athlete and plant eater who strives to optimize every living ecosystem. Today's episode is incredibly information dense. But just before we get into it, I want to give a quick note. For those who haven't left a review on the show before, I really implore you to do so. And for those who have, I really appreciate every single one of you. I know there is a fair bit of 5-star reviews in there, and I'm incredibly humbled by that. If there's one way you can help the show today, it's definitely just by leaving a review, which takes 5 seconds, whether you're on Spotify, you just want to click that 5 stars, or Apple, or even on YouTube, just liking, commenting, subscribing. That really helps the show in a very wholesome and abundant way. Now on to today's episode with Vladislav Kaim. Now, as you can tell, Vlad is from Europe and he's one of the UNs Youth Advisory Group on climate change. Vlad is a young economist committed to ensuring green and decent jobs for youth, and his specialty is in international trade and migration, with his most recent assignment being representation of youth interest at a UN high-level dialogue on energy platforms. We'll be talking all things economics and how that affects climate change and the green future we have to build and thrive as a society. Vlad has had extensive experience through the COPs and has thought a lot about a lot of these really pressing issues that we face in today's society, something that we haven't touched on the show, especially migration, especially green jobs, which will be defining that and looking at how that affects us, whether you're a youth or whether you're older or whether you're younger, whether you're a teenager. These things really affect us at a emotional, financial, and really every level that embodies our future. So this is really a conversation in the present that is about our future through evaluating our past. I really had an incredible time talking to Vlad. He's incredibly intelligent, so I really appreciate him taking the time out to have this conversation with us. And I'm sure that if you stick around for the whole conversation, whether you watch or listen to it, you'll find it incredibly deep. With all my yapping out of the way, let's get Vlad onto the platform to share his wisdom. Mr. Vlad Kaim, welcome to the Plant Paradigm Podcast. How are you going?
Thank you, Tom. It's my pleasure.
Amazing. I'm hoping through technical difficulties you don't get cut off and we can have this awesome conversation today. And there's a lot we're gonna be talking about, and some really interesting things like economics in terms of green jobs and debt relief and all that sort of stuff, which is really exciting. But I thought to start this off really well for all our listeners and viewers, would you like to just run through what it is in particularly you do in the work of in green jobs and economics and climate change and all of that?
Sure. First of all, a little bit about myself. I am 26 years old. I'm an economist by education. My initial specialty within economics was international trade. When I have graduated with my master's from Lund University in Sweden, where I'm based right now, I wrote my final thesis on the impact of trade and sustainable development chapters in the free trade agreements that the EU was concluding starting from 2011 over its imports of green goods. I am mainly focused right now on my work as part of the inaugural UN Secretary General's Youth Advisory Group on climate change. Where I am mainstreaming the green jobs as a policy point, as a policy issue. And this is indeed something that Secretary General has started more forcefully speaking on. And apart from that, I am also the contact point on green jobs for Yango, official youth constituency of the UNFCCC. But of course, here in this podcast, like any other interview, I represent solely my own opinions. Before that, I was also happy to enter a little bit into history by being part of the cohort that helped co-organize the first ever UN Youth Climate Summit back in 2019. And the last but not the least, I'm coming from Moldova, a tiny country in southeast of Europe that has been propelled to global highlights through its extremely generous welcome given to our Ukrainian brothers fleeing the war recently. So that's I think as good of an intro as it gets.
Absolutely. Look, there's so many ways we can really start this off. Firstly, in your experience working under the UN Secretary General and all your work and your time at COP26, which I saw you were there, do you think young people are represented quite well in the space of I guess sustainability, environmentalism, and green jobs? Like, are young people really well represented there?
So the fields that you mentioned have different situations and different challenges. So I will go one by one through them. When it comes to the climate and sustainability sphere, the institutional structures of engagement, they are absolutely there. So there is formalized engagement, which is better than nothing. At the same time, if we take specifically COP26 as a case of youth engagement, this has been a flop because there were immense logistical challenges with a city that has not been prepared to host such an enormous amount of people. And the first one who were to suffer were, of course, those who were the most price sensitive, ergo youth. Secondly, we add to that the pretty restrictive visa policies, even though there were certain relaxations, but still, we all know unfortunate turns in the migration and entry policy of the host country of COP26 post-Brexit, and that inevitably had its impact. So basically, it was a little bit of a regress compared to COP25, say, but at the same time, there were certain important formal results that were achieved at COP26 that were not there before, like, for example, the interventions that youth managed to provide in official capacities. Youth constituency has increased by quite a bit. Youth constituency got a permanent seat on the committee overseeing technology mechanism. However, at the same time, youth observers were often still kicked out of the negotiation rooms, especially on the thorniest of the topics in the Paris Agreement, like, for example, Article 6, carbon markets, climate finance, all that stuff. So we are looking at a landscape where there is progress made in youth engagement in certain areas, but there is still quite a lot of work to be done in the others. And there is still a search for that high-level advocate, whoever that COP presidency will be, that will take the cause of youth with utmost seriousness and will allow youth engaged in this process to work, not against this stream, but finally with full throated support. Granted, again, it is growing throughout the years, but it's still not at the point where the main energies that we as youth engaged in this process can direct would primarily go not to battling, certain adversities, difficulties, or certain recalcitrant participants.
There's a lot there, and I think at a certain way, and I hadn't thought about the COP26 levels of discrimination that might have happened with certain visa issues and with obviously the price of that. I saw photos and some videos of their main conference hall that was just packed in like sardines, which was ironic given, COVID was still alive and well. And there was a lot going on. But in your field, let's sideline that for a second. You work a lot with economics and green jobs. And in my mind, and I might be wrong, I hope I am, when I'm thinking of economics and green jobs, I'm thinking a lot of it's a very complicated and convoluted topic. I'm thinking to work in that field, such as yourself, you have to be, or most people would be quite older. And so naturally, there's not going to be a lot of young voices. What can we do to increase that?
With green jobs as a topic, this might not necessarily have been the case, but it is indeed also bound to this general dynamic of, first and foremost, unequal numerical representation when it comes to age categories and generational groups, but also a steep discount at which youth expertise is taken compared to the adult expertise, even though youth expertise, first of all, at its analytical level, especially from the colleagues who are engaged in the formal UNFCCC processes, is absolutely not lower in quality than when it comes to more experienced colleagues. And in its empirics, in fact, I would argue it supersedes theirs. The only that is lacking and which sets us back is simply less experience by virtue of the age and fewer contacts. So that plays quite a significant role in still tilting the playing field, not in our favor. However, with the green jobs in particular as the topic, it is an issue that has started being mainstreamed quite recently, and it is still yet to find a home in the settings such as COPs. Because, for example, if you would put it as an, I don't know, agenda sub-point to at least some matter of negotiations, where would you put it? Would you put it, for example, in negotiations on adaptation? Because we can argue that if people have to move from certain areas or to engage more forcefully in to work in conservation to make sure that they are able to live where they live, regardless of what's happening, is this transition to green jobs, or like, for example, when Europe is actively going towards green industry, is it a form of adaptation? Do we count it as such or not? Or if we're focusing on building, say, green skills for the youth of today and the youth of tomorrow to be able to transition into green jobs, would it be something that we could count as a thing worth of discussion under the pillar that is called Action for Climate Empowerment, where it's basically you negotiate the programs of action for the public to engage with the implementation of Paris Agreement? And so it is still early days, but it is what has been heartening for me to see at COP26. It's that the cause is getting substantial institutional backers. First of all, I'm talking about International Labour Organization. They have done tremendous work in this regard. They were supporting the UN Secretary General in launching the Climate Action for Jobs initiative in 2019. After that famous UN Youth Climate Summit, when there was main UN Climate Summit. And they have been great partners of ours in the Green Jobs Working Group on all the matters related to promoting green jobs for youth. And this is a journey that is going to continue. And I expect that this as an issue will grow in importance, especially now that we are going to Africa for the next COP. Mm-hmm. And this is a continent that has by far the biggest youth population that is coming out there in the world, and who needs local, decent, impactful, well-paid jobs. And mainly, they would, if for them to be stable, they would need to come from sectors such as clean energy, expanded in general energy access, and from various positive developments in sustainable agriculture, and so on and so on. Even tree planting, if we're counting commitments that were made to prevent what is happening in the Sahel region right now, that is the desertification that is going there. So this is something that will grow in importance when we move to the COPs in the regions where that would be more of a salient issue, not just for the sake of climate agenda, but also, of course, the political, social stability.
Yeah, I find it, firstly, there's so much, and I want to touch back on green jobs specifically, but I find it so, I think, fitting that they've chosen to have this COP27 in Egypt, because, and I was listening to something, I'm not sure if you have any thoughts on this or you heard this, But there's a lot of funding that has been kind of thought about. We should kind of divert a lot of funding for sustainable and environmentally friendly technologies to Africa, because they're the developing nations that are going to be suffering the most with this. So estimates have been put out that something like 15 billion US dollars have to be given to Africa to set them up properly, so that when they grow and develop, they're not growing in the wrong direction. But they've also come out and said, if we don't give them that $15 billion, it's going to cost around $200 billion to tackle the kind of the cost of not doing anything and not acting towards climate change. So I find it very fitting that the COP is in a continent that's actually going to be, the next decade, is going to really see them set up for either failure or success.
No, I completely agree with that. If especially if we remember how the last decade started, and we can see that this decade can start essentially in the same way, especially if we're talking about a country such as Egypt, who is in a very tight spot right now by virtue of having been very dependent on grain imports, both from Russia and Ukraine. So I absolutely agree that this is a matter that will be of extreme importance for the African countries. And the only issue is, of course, that it's again being stonewalled by the lack of political will and by the lack of necessary capacity in institutional terms in the countries that might be in need of receiving this. There are two tracks that are taking care of this in the formal negotiation. Those are technology transfer negotiations and climate finance negotiations. However, obviously, as we can see, especially in the climate finance track, they are going quite slowly. There is more than its fair share of distrust. And this trust deficit needs to be overcome somehow during this year. We will see how that will proceed. That's in the ball. The ball's in the court of developed countries to deliver on that. And I would also like to point out here, to quote my colleague, the chair of the Youth Advisory Group, Nisrin Al-Saim, who herself is a negotiator in the African Club of Negotiators, actually, on technology transfer, that when it comes to the assistance of this kind and plus climate finance, so far, mostly all that assistance is going to 5 out of 54 African countries. So
Wow.
it's not only the
That's
issue
really
of...
sad.
Yes. So we are not talking only about the problem with the bulk amount that is going there. I mean, we have seen the Just Transition deal on South Africa that was clinched during COP26 grabbing all the headlines. But even that deal overall is to the tune of $8 billion, while the needs, of course, are much larger. So it's not only the issue of the bulk amount that you mentioned, it's also the issue of distribution, because for example, when we see the impacts that are visible, we see that it's not only, and not even mostly, like the top receiver countries, but it's also the countries who are extremely vulnerable in different contexts. Like I mentioned already, the countries in Sahel, with their issues of desertification and all the effects that their desertification triggers afterwards. We see that another super intensive drought struck Somalia. We see we see Mozambique that has been absolutely ravaged by cyclones recently. We see Madagascar that was stricken by famine that was with high confidence for the first time ever attributable to the man-made, the humanly caused climate change. So we also need, apart from the simple lack of provision of funds, we will also need to tackle the geographical distribution of said funds and the agency of these local actors in these countries that are hard hit on how those funds are spent or invested.
That would be, I would not want that person's job, because really, when I'm thinking about it, if you look at, say, the atrocity that has just happened in Madagascar, which I did read about, is incredibly sad. And you've got then countries that are also suffering, Ethiopia, like you mentioned, Mozambique. All these countries have a very unique set of problems that are, with a very high confidence, attributed to human activities. And so how would someone even quantify how much money are you giving either per capita, per GDP to these countries? Like, is Madagascar more important than Ethiopia? Like, how can we figure that out? Like, that is a super important question, and I wouldn't even know where to start.
Well, the most perspective venue for doing that is actually negotiations on two topics. It's again about climate finance, but also it's about loss and damage. That term that we have heard a lot during COP26, and which is essentially referring to the obligation, a moral one we're talking about, unfortunately, not legal yet. Obligation of the worst historical emitters to pay for the losses and damages already incurred by the most vulnerable and the least contributing countries as a result of the climate change caused by said historical emitters. And unfortunately, here we come to another sore point of COP26, that of demand from the, especially island countries. We're talking about small island countries. The demand that they put for a target on loss and damage finance that was replaced by, wait for it, promise to conduct a high-level seminar on the issue to determine the needs.
Right.
So yeah, that caused quite a bit of dismay among
So essentially, like,
among colleagues. Yeah,
they're saying,
the
like,
only
you don't care enough about us. Is that like?
yeah, pretty much. And I smiled and laughed at it about a little bit at it because I remember how exasperated everybody was about it, and it was like sardonic but very sour reaction to this. And the fact that the only two entities that actually contributed with pledges of additional loss and damage financing were not even countries, but the governments of Scotland and the Belgian region of Wallonie. That was around like $1-2 million each. I think that was especially painful for the colleagues from the countries who are heavily dependent on recognition of the loss and damage that is already caused to them and will be caused to them. I'm pretty sure that this is something that will come back more forcefully at COP27 because it has to. Otherwise, it's an elephant in the room, and those suck oxygen out of those rooms a lot, and we don't need that.
Yeah, that's, I forgot the prime minister's name, but I believe it was Solomon Island who did his conference like waist deep in water, and said something like a few years ago, this was just land, and now I'm waist deep. And there was reports saying like Fiji's islands are starting to submerge, and it, like, what can we expect as, and I'm not sure here how frightening it would be if a literal country with hundreds of islands just disappeared off maps. Like, firstly, the emotional damage would be incredible. The economic impact of a country disappearing, potentially millions, billions of dollars disappearing because of climate change. Like, there seems to be more and more, as we kind of progress and learn and listen to the science, there seems to be a very, very real danger of a catastrophic economic impact of climate change, and that's becoming more and more real.
Unfortunately, I have to say here, when it comes to economic impact and the wake-up effect, it will depend a lot on what country will sink. I'm very sorry for having to say that, but we see with the events such as war that Russia is waging against Ukraine, with the coverage of the outcomes of COP26 and so on, that the world, in terms of its capability to act, is highly dependent on the length of Western media attention cycle.
Mm-hmm.
And thus, especially in the economic context of today, even if, and I'm saying this with great sadness, but I think it's important to call a spade, that if we see tomorrow a country like, I don't know, say Palau, that John Kerry is visiting right now. I met some of the members of delegations of Palau at COP26, wonderful people, had to travel 5 days to reach Glasgow. Fascinating story. If Palau disappears tomorrow, we will see perhaps, I don't know, a few weeks of reports on CNN and stuff like that. We will see like a lot of like concerts and pledges and so on. Potentially, I don't know, same Australia will save some people and bring them as refugees. But the economic impact, I am not sure if it will be priced in by the most developed economies and societies to the level of the urgency that would be required. Simply because we are in that stage of historical development, or rather historical repetition, where something that is happening beyond your borders is always scary, and you would rather wish it away. I mean, we should not look any further than the U.S. under the presidency of Donald Trump, for example. And we see the huge appeal that is exercised by Marine Le Pen right now in the second round of the presidential election in France. So I unfortunately am not in the camp of those who think that a catastrophe will change the mind of the key policymakers in the West. If anything, it will probably make them dig in and defend themselves even more, to avoid conceding that it's been their policies that ultimately led, or like lack of necessary policies that led to this. So, if you want to see an example of this, look at how unapologetic Angela Merkel is right now for her energy policy, even though this is literally what prevents Germany right now from being from acting way more forcefully on sanctions against Russia.
Mm-hmm. That's I appreciate the fact that you can come out here and say a spade is a spade, and that might very well be true, that Fiji sinks and then we have a few weeks of news and then all of a sudden somehow it's back to normal with a few extra refugees in a few countries. How, like, I understand. All right, so let's circle back to green jobs for a second before we continue on here. So I've mentioned that a few times, and we can safely assume, based on the name, it is important for our transition to green energy to have green jobs. Can you help define what exactly makes a job green?
So I will. That will come not out of my mouth, but it's a definition that was provided by the ILO. Essentially, when we're talking about green jobs, we are talking about jobs that, through their exercise, either do not contribute additionally to the stock of the greenhouse emissions, or actively contribute to its reduction.
Mm-hmm.
So
I like that. Simple.
yeah.
So with that now, and then we've got this whole topic of economics, and we've discussed a few things that need some major improvements, especially as the COPs are conducted. What, if you were to sum up in a few ways, what do you think we are doing wrong?
When it comes to green jobs, I think what we're doing wrong is, first and foremost, the way we're framing it. There is a lot of talk, not only in this domain, but in general, when we talk about energy transition, about cost, without this debate being honest. And what I mean without this debate being honest is without putting as the counterfactual the cost of inaction, first and foremost, and without presenting comparable returns on investment, or lack of investment in the second case. If these presentations were more direct, and more honest in this regard, the speed of decision making would have been much more forceful, and more ambitious energy transition policies would make much more common sense. Apart from that, this is also a loss of narrative. Without an honest representation of the costs and investments benefits, the advocates for strong energy transition might also lose the narrative battle, especially, and here I am referring particularly to the Western democratic societies, because in other societies, the context is a little bit different. This also leads to the hemorrhaging of the working class vote and their turn towards populist challengers. Even though green jobs is actually a perfect remedy for many of the grievances that the working classes in the US, Europe, Australia, New Zealand have been experiencing since the 2008 financial crisis. Green jobs, in many cases, if accounted for well in terms of educational pathways to them, they are in fact appealing to those who constituted the working class of the yesteryear, mainly people who have not had, for various reasons, access to high education, to tertiary education. And those jobs, many of them, require very specific technical education, which can be perfectly well achieved in the vocational sector if it is A, well-resourced, B, well propagated, C, future-proof by a strong collaboration with the private sector in terms of creating curricula, establishing dual programs where people can also learn on the jobs, and D, clear pathways, again, together with the corporate actors, for lifelong learning. Because in green jobs, like in any other jobs of today and tomorrow, people will change their careers quite often. To illustrate what I mean by this example, that it is specifically would be affecting the working class constituencies and the constituencies of people who haven't had access to higher education, I would like to come back to Germany again. We, for example, look at what is happening right now in their energy market in general. People are anticipating that Russian gas may soon dry out, and many want to change. Many households want to change from gas boilers to heat pumps, but installing them requires a certain amount of skilled technicians, and so they are just not there, even though German government significantly relaxed its immigration rules for certain categories of workers, including from those outside of the EU. So in many cases, for some very unsexy interventions on the one hand, but extremely efficient on the other, when it comes to climate action, emission reduction, and so on, the problem is not that technologies are not yet there, or that they're too costly, but the simple fact that there are unfortunately not enough qualified people to take on those jobs and to drive those businesses forward. And if this is a shortage that is manifesting itself already now, imagine what will happen if we are 10 years from now and we have still no clear working strategies on this front, and we are in the middle of an energy transition.
So would you say, overall, and this is a loaded question, so really what I'm getting out of this, and this is simplifying it, we're not overall ready for a full-fledged energy transition to green energies?
I'm not sure that the answer to this is a yes and yes-no binary, because there are different degrees of readiness to this. I think the degree of readiness towards energy transition in the year of our Lord 2022 is certainly better than it was, for example, at the time when the Paris Agreement was signed. Yet, it's not at the point where it would be good enough for us to come to, say, 2030, look at the clock, look at the carbon budget and say, yes, we are still within that new IPCC scenario of no overshoot. I find it unlikely at this pace. I mean, look at how much money was, and I'm using this term deliberately, wasted by G20 economists on fossil fuel subsidies during during COVID relief packages adoption in 2020, 2021. Those are hundreds of billions of dollars that could have been put to good use, but were not. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, Tom, your home country is in the front line of that regret.
Yeah, don't worry, we know. We are on the show. The amount of times I've called my country an absolute disgrace in a lot of ways is ridiculous.
But we're not going to dive into that because I know you're going to have election in a month. So
yes,
we'll leave it to you to decide.
I think the consensus right now is we're getting out Scott Morrison, who was our leader. I think there is a general swaying towards the opposition, not Scott. So I'm hoping we get them out and have some change. Although, you know, there's never going to be, I think, a leader, especially in Australia, for a while that's really going to tick all of our boxes. I think because we're so screwed up, we're just after someone a little bit better.
Mm-hmm. Choosing the lesser of two evils. Where have I seen that before?
Yeah. Literally. So I find that really fascinating about the green jobs and a lack of kind of workers, so to speak. Because when I'm thinking about it, and you know, we're similar age. You're 26, I'm 25, and if I were to think back to when I was 17 or 18, I'm like, if I could go back to uni, or even if I go now to university, I'm like, what would I study? And I think that's something a lot of young people ask themselves, because I think with our generation, we understand that we can have multiple careers, multiple interests, all these things. And I'm thinking, okay, if I go to study in climate change in some facet, it's like some part of me is worried that by the time I finish my 3, 4, 5 year degree, the world is going to be infinitely different and my qualification is just worthless. So with your perspective here, you clearly have thought about certain industries or skills that are going to be super necessary for us to establish this transition. What jobs or fields do you think that people should focus on if they're looking to kind of get into this field, or they're passionate about helping this transition?
Well, again, I will here put a division between jobs that would require higher education and those who would not. But that doesn't mean that if your job would not require higher education, that it would be any less valuable or less paid. Quite to the contrary, in fact, and would not require less education on the job. So with that in mind, we would proceed. So in the first category, we are talking about, of course, all sorts of technicians in installation and maintenance across a wider spectrum of renewable energy sources. We are also talking about those who would be working for the contractors that would help households insulate their homes, help them install heat pumps, potentially also transition those households to power to X, as it's called, to achieve greater integration between heating and electricity. So that is the category of the jobs that require specialized technical education. When it comes to the jobs that require higher education, I think research and development in clean energy, this is something that should interest many of us because R&D is where many battles for climate action are won or lost, especially when it comes to determining the fate of scalability of certain important technologies. We are talking about the jobs in hard-to-abate industries, especially for specialists who would be battling such important topics as decarbonization of processes like cement production, carbon-free steel. I mean, I have an example in my family. My father-in-law is working on a plant in the north of Sweden that managed to start producing a special type of iron that is producing 90% fewer carbon emissions than before, thanks to the technology they have, and is using as a feeder for the carbon neutral steel that would be produced starting from 2026 and be supplied to Volvo for their cars. So we are talking about hard to abate sectors where there would be a lot of positions for tech people, for chemists, for those who would be also into industrial carbon capture and storage. Of course, we are also talking about people from not only industries, though among industries, I would also probably want to emphasize shipping, specialists in decarbonization of maritime shipping. This is one of the stickiest, if we take aviation aside for a second, one of the stickiest sectors when it comes to reduction of carbon emissions. I mean, we will see how the efforts of Maersk, for example, would go to present their first ever carbon neutral ship in the second half of this decade. But this is also an industry to keep a close eye on. And the service sector, we should not pass by our attention. For especially, I'm talking about all the colleagues who will be going in all sorts of sectors of banking, because apart from the moral aspect of the industry, unfortunately, still being a very serious contributor to the climate crisis through financing of fossil fuels, we also see that industries such as banking, consulting, and others, they are only now like rolling out the proper capacities and practices when it comes to sustainability, when it comes to green investment, green bonds, and so on. And in order for this to flourish, you of course need skilled operators, so to speak, of these nascent and sometimes already functioning green financial systems. Because if we have service industries that cannot funnel green investments into the industries themselves will not have incentives to become green, even if, for example, there is a forceful political movement in power that through legislation would push them towards that. But ultimately, it also comes down to the provision of financial resources, and those allocations, they speak volumes about the moods among the key economic players more than any legislation. However, we would want more that it would rather be a matter of democratic control. I would, for example.
That is a insane list, and I'm also very impressed with the fact that you've memorized almost every single job that we need so vividly. And just touching on the bank thing for a second, you mentioned a big problem with the banks we have in today's world is the financing of certain projects like new gas discovery and things like this. So if someone doesn't know if their bank does that, there are websites and apps that are designed to find that. So I just want to put that in there as a side note. If you want to switch banks, that is an option you can do. But kind of on the funding of, say, fossil fuels and these kinds of things, have you thought about how you think the transition away from fossil fuels will look like? Like, will they're obviously not going to go down without a big fight, as we're seeing. But do you see that slowly kind of creeping down until we hit to like 2030, 2040, 2050, whenever we kind of really flick the switch on that one?
So first and foremost, regarding the first part of your intro to this question, even though we see apps and techs that are bringing more transparency in, for example, in terms of the products we invest in, reading the small print and third-party information about this still pays off. Like I, for example, am blessed to have a pension plan that is fully proof when it comes to sustainability credentials. But even there, I am still constantly doing my research to make sure that they do not rip me off on that front. So this is
Thank
something
you for
that we
adding
as
that.
consumers have to be vigilant of, even though it should not be our burden as consumers and like people who have daily things to attend to do our due diligence on that in such a volume. This is something that should be subject to regular consumer protection legislation, like many other aspects of consumer interactions in our life. Now to your question, I think we need to focus on two aspects here. First is the current holdings in fossil fuel assets, and secondly, potential new investments. The first one is a little bit more salient in today's world because investments in current fossil fuel interests, they usually, depending on the case, we're talking about a cycle between 30 to 50 years. So accelerating the cash out of them, if you are, say, a pension fund, especially if you are, I don't know, a big national pension fund, like, say, Norwegian, which is like an arch example of that, is paramount, because ultimately many of those assets, they are bound to become what is known as stranded assets. Essentially, assets that those value will not be justified by the expenses that will grow manifold by virtue of how more vulnerable to the effects of climate change they become. Because many of those oil rigs ultimately, they are offshore. And this is a huge calculus, element of the calculus, not only for the pension funds, but also, for example, for insurance companies. I mean, insurance companies, they are even stiffer in this regard than banks, because the price of the mistake is much bigger for them, really, in this particular matter. And so for them, the incentive to price risk is higher, and they are more vigilant in this regard. Perhaps still not as vigilant as they should be. I mean, we have seen recently the Extinction Rebellion protest in London, where they came to the Lloyd's headquarters. Still, unfortunately, even they are not there yet, but they are further there than banks and pension funds. But we see more and more right now coalitions of asset owners being committed to net zero. What I would like to see from there is a better oversight, so that the initiatives such as, for example, science-based targets would be very strictly and forcefully applied to those. Because I absolutely hate those headlines of the type, 130 trillions in assets now committed to net zero. It is extremely manipulative. It doesn't mean that all those assets are now equally serving the objective of net zero. If anything, most of them could be still actively undermining it by virtue of where they're placed. This is the first pillar. The second pillar is the potential investments coming further, because we see worrying signs, such as, for example, in the UK, where there might be a new opening of drills in the North Sea. And of course, that would attract certain companies who, in their turn, have investments coming from many actors, potentially including pension funds. And here we need, I think, first and foremost, stricter legislation on what we define as fiduciary duty towards the shareholders, towards the investors, and how do we square it with the duty towards future generations when it comes to ambitious climate policy. Because if you are investing in fossil fuels now, you are investing in a stranded asset in 30 years that you will not get your returns from, but it will already start producing additional misery towards the planet. And even on the other hand, there is a solace in that I take in that, and it's the fact that those who are advocating for additional oil as a solution in terms of security for the current energy crisis do not seem to realize that from even a moment of approval to the moment when the drilling will start, many decades will take. So in fact, those investments, not only they will pay off in any financial way, you will not even be able to start to see how they will pay off to you in decades. Many of those shareholders and investors will not be alive to see any effects of that. While here you have already in a decade significant and tangible wholesale transformation of the wind power. Not even talking about solar power. We see the potential growth of green hydrogen. And so my solution to that, well, it's hardly to call it a solution, but suggestion, let's call it like this, is going to democratic way to the legislation and making sure that the principles of fiduciary duty they towards shareholders, they do not go in conflict with the duty towards future generations. But unfortunately, we see the duty towards future generations is very hard to legislate. I mean, Australia is the prime example of that. Your High Court of Appeals threw out the lawsuit from the kids with regards to approval of the coal mines and the impact on future generations. And if the court, I very much salute always the activist way of going through courts. I think it's wonderful that we can leverage rule of law to the benefit of climate action. I mean, we have seen this happening in Germany, but unfortunately, the judicial route might still not be available. And thus, it's back to the legislative drawing board in this case.
Yeah, I really love how you particularly put an emphasis on these pension funds when we're looking at industries like fossil fuels, because a lot of the time we actually don't know that we're funding these things. Like if you're very into being a sustainable human being and you have this pension fund that you're like, oh, you know, I use it because my dad used it, or I use it because I saw an ad and they promise these great returns or whatever it is. And you don't actually know that you're not only hurting your financial position, because like you said, in 30 years time, you're going to have your hands in an asset that's essentially worthless because we've transitioned away from it. So it's really important to know where your money is going. And when we're looking at, say, phasing out the fossil fuels like you're talking about, we hold a role in that as well. I think a lot of the times we give a lot of power to the government and to big corporations because they are powerful. There's a lot of powerful people there. But when it comes to what we can do in the numbers that we have, like in Australia, you mentioned, we've got 24, 25 million people. If everyone switched their pension funds to not fund fossil fuels, we would be having a completely different conversation.
That is true. But however, here I would like also to take issue with this narrative of why doesn't everybody just switch? And this comes only not to pension funds here, but in general, because there is an issue of coordination of the switch that we miss. We cannot rely on the minuscule probability of all the people collectively at one moment or in a short span together waking up and doing this. It is a very time-consuming exercise. And so this is why we have the state. The coordination function for such a transition belongs to the state, to democratically elected legislature and the government elected by said legislature. And it's even where you can and you have time and resources to provide this change on your own and help others, wonderful, do it. But many do not. But what they can do is to demand from those whom they pay from their taxes to do that, to actually do that. Mm-hmm. This is why we advanced in our societal development to the point where we recognize the sovereign state as the key actor in assuring all those what we call common goods. And climate action is a common good. So ultimately, it all comes down to the ability to provide the democratic oversight of this and democratic pressure that is necessary. That is why I am not personally scared of giving, as you said, too much power to the government. I am scared of giving too much power to the government that does not give a damn, and giving too little power to the government that would give. But about big corporations, I absolutely agree, because regardless of what we see from, especially after the pandemic, from corporate actors, like for example, there was this famous Business Roundtable statement that officially denounced the 40-year-long Milton Friedman's doctrine of shareholders' primacy and that businesses serve only their own shareholders. You cannot just flip the switch in just like that of a moment and completely go on another rails. Those are still companies that were built with shareholders and shareholders only in mind. So I am more of an opinion with regards to them is that we should not invest that much of our effort in time into trying to push them to do what they are not equipped to do unless they commit to the wholesale transformation of their business models to begin with. But what we can ask them already now is, first and foremost, pay your taxes. Because many of the efforts towards climate action, they are public projects. They are projects undertaken by nation states. States signed up to Paris Agreement. States negotiate in the UNFCCC. So pay your taxes to the governments and legislatures elected by the people that will enact climate legislation on behalf of the people. And second, make them commit to not be able to lobby and influence legislation related to climate action. Campaign finance laws. These are two immediate actions that I would myself strongly be advocating for in any Western society. Crack down on tax evasion and tightening of the campaigning finance laws from corporates, especially when it comes to matters related to campaigns that are related to climate-related legislation from the point of certain degree of skepticism. But even on the supporting part, it could be sometimes also supported by companies who might, under the guise of green production, violate labor rights, for example. So that's not necessarily only applying to one side. But the point being is that the transformation of the companies and those actors that we imagine them to be will take much more time than we currently have. And so while we need to keep pushing them in that direction, in the moment right now, there are two actions that I put out there before that would have much more immediate beneficial effect, not only for climate, but also for democracy. Because without a healthy democracy, healthy climate action will not be possible.
I think that's a really important point, and something I've been thinking about a lot with the point of like lobbyists, especially when they got their own very, very tight vested interests that are lobbying to politicians are almost in a way a threat to our democracy. But to your point about fighting tax evasion, that is such a big issue that is so multifaceted. Like I personally pay more tax in this country than the top 5 biggest oil and gas companies in Australia because they pay zero. They pay nothing. And how they get away with that is the biggest joke of our century. So that's really important to kind of tackle the tax evasion and what comes down to that and how we do that. You had great points. And the only one I would add is educating ourselves as to who in this political space is not going to give us that. Because you're right, like I am grateful every single day that I live in a country that is a democracy. Like that is a beautiful thing to have, I think. And the fact that I have a leader right now that doesn't really agree with that is really sad. And so especially, for Aussies, and by the time this episode is out, I'm not sure if we have had that vote yet, or for everyone, broadly speaking, and I'm sure you'll agree, Vlad, voting is crucial. And not voting is crucial. Understanding who we're voting for and why is crucial for literally not just the economics of climate change in the future, but for everything that actually impacts us, because the government is a people pleasing, or hopefully wanting to people please, democracy.
I agree with that. I would also add one more point. Apart from voting, it's also about the level playing field. Whom the starting positions and the legislation benefits, it's extremely important, because you can have squeaky clean election process itself, high voter turnout and so on, but you can have, for example, all the media supporting one person. You can have a legislation that says, I don't know, you can have anonymous donations of any sum, no strings attached, and many other shenanigans. You can abuse, I don't know, I think in Australia it's also is first past the post system, to make sure that they're essentially by committing not to reform it, because it allows for skewed representation towards party who is in power, and so on and so on. So it goes deeper than the day of the vote, and this is something that we need to be realistic about, because electoral systems, they are exactly that. They are systems. They are based on many cogs that are within it. And even though it is the same case as with pension funds, as we say, that like people might not have time because, they have jobs, they have the worst inflation in 30 years, and so on and so forth. But here, an effort needs to be made for people to be able to call out those irregularities and improve the health of the level playing field in electoral processes. Because even for those people who are blessed to live in democracies, and by the way, unfortunately, those are only 20% of the global population, many of those democracies are far from perfect. And it is shown in the fact that when you go to climate action negotiations, oftentimes, depending on the years, you can see as many democratic countries as non-democratic that are impeding increase in climate ambition. And that kind of doesn't square up with the narrative of democratic countries always standing up better for climate action. And it's a pity, because if we cannot lead in those two aspects, there would be no any other credibility, internal or external, for that matter.
Yeah. Look, man, I want to just change gears, because I know we've been going for a little bit now. Look, you mentioned at the beginning that you work with international trade and migration. This is something we haven't talked about on the show at all. Can you give us a run through on what, how that really affects our future in terms, or through the lens of sustainability, and what our problem is here, and how we can address anything?
So with trade, we have a bouquet of problems that are also exacerbated by the fact that international trade actually enormously helps humankind. But first and foremost, a significant share of global trade goes by sea, which means maritime shipping is in demand. I mean, we have seen during the height of COVID, the freight rates around the world. The freight rates of yesterday, by the way, are the huge explanation for the rates of inflation that we have today. So for that maritime shipping to work, you need ships. Those ships need what? Bunker fuel. Is bunker fuel useful for climate action? No, it's not. Even after the 2020 tightening of standards by the International Maritime Organizations for the sulfur content in the bunker fuel. So there is this problematic moment. Second moment is the patterns of trade. And those patterns of trade are primarily telling us that many developing economies are locked in exports of carbon-intensive goods, and B, they might not be able, even in those niches where they are competitive that are carbon-intensive, to be able to move up the value chain. So we have an outcome that basically results in higher imported emissions for developed countries that they can sometimes not account for, but also an effect of lock-in for the developing countries in terms of the possibilities for their economic development. And that is why you have in the development literature such a notion as middle income trap for many countries. And thirdly, it is about the local incentives that international trade creates sometimes. The arch examples of that is the demand for palm oil, for example, which has significantly transformed for the worse such important geographical regions and ecosystems as forests on the island of Borneo. This is just one of the examples. There are many others. We see, for example, right now, one of the lenses, in fact, that is rarer discussed of the war that Russia is waging against Ukraine is the fact that we have the battle here between two agricultural superpowers. And the agricultural superpower that is the victim of the aggression here has very, very significant deposits of black soil. So oftentimes, the way that the international trade system is regulated right now, it is biased towards, first and foremost, the preferences of developed countries in terms of setting the terms for trade, and the way how the flows of carbon-intensive and less so carbon-intensive goods are flowing. And last point is that in general, international trading system is quite a disarray, even if we put the climate issue aside. Because since 2019, the key pillar of international trading system, the appellate body of the World Trade Organization, doesn't work. Because the veto that Trump administration has put on the appointment of new members of this body played its toll, took its toll. And if countries do not believe that they can peacefully settle their disputes in an international and multilateral setting, they will revert to regional blocs. And that is why we have, for example, the rising comprehensive economic partnership agreement that China and many other countries have signed up to. That's why we have CPTPP. And this fragmentation of the trade, it would not necessarily lead to better outcomes for climate. It will just mean that the countries that suffer the most from the inability to move up the value chain and from the climate impacts will be locked in at the similar position in regional chains instead of the global ones. And when it comes to migration, the impact is even more direct to see. We have many swaths of our planet that will become inhabitable to live. Those swaths of land are populated right now. These people will need to move somewhere. Most of the people move to the neighboring countries, which are also not among the highest developed. And yet we are also facing a situation in which the backlash against people from those regions that would come to countries such as those of the EU, Australia, the US, is at its highest. How do we reconcile this reality with the fact that these people would run, because you cannot live where the temperature is 50 degrees casually in the summer. You simply cannot. But at the same time, there are politicians who are saying, no, we are full. We cannot do that anymore. Even though, we'll bring example from Sweden. I was doing a day trip in the north of Sweden. It was a mini mountain that I climbed together with my wife. And when we climbed and looked at like many dozens of kilometers ahead or to the east or to the west, this is just forest and like nothing is going on there. And then we said, remember the leader of the party? There is a far right party in Sweden who said there is no more place for migrants in Sweden. Mind you, the population density in Sweden is something like 0.25 people per square kilometer or something like that. So this is going to be as much as a humanitarian problem as political. We are risking by our indifference and sometimes outright hostility and lack of planning to seal the fate of potentially 250 million people if we do not plan for the consequences of climate emergency for these people now. If we do not start developing plans to help them cover for their losses and damages locally, for their adaptation, and when any adaptation becomes impossible, for their fast relocation, and the ability not to sit in those squalid camps like it happens shamefully too often for decades. Without that, it's going to be a tragedy. And unfortunately, I'm afraid, again, as with the case of a state potentially sinking, it might be a silent tragedy because the particularities of the Western media cycle are the following: that the region where the tragedy happens, unfortunately, will influence the coverage a lot. And I'm saying this as an Eastern European who is very happy to see for how long the coverage of Ukraine is still up in the news, which I did not expect. But when you contrast it to what is happening, for example, in other regions, like say in sub-Saharan Africa, it's you feel sad. You feel sad at the injustice of it, and you're feeling worried that at the moment where the countries of our region can experience the moment of greatest allyship with these countries by virtue of the common relatability of common experiences of imperial oppression from colonial powers. Instead, you will have this competition for attention that those same imperial powers will use to their benefit.
There's so many directions I can take this before we finish up, but one thing I do want to know is I've thought about this concept of migration for a little while now, and I read a bit about it. Yuval Noah Harari has talked a bit extensively about the concept of migration and if a nation should be held responsible to allowing people who are seeking refuge or that need to migrate, because we're going to have a lot of people, and I don't know the number, but there's going to be millions of people that are going to become climate refugees, which is going to be very scary in the near future. But to your point, you climb this mountain in northern Sweden, you see left and right just forest, forest, forest. And part of me says, I'm glad that they're forests, because I understand that, yes, like 0.25%, I thought it'd be way higher than that. That's really surprising. I think the problem is not that it's 0.25%. I think it's that in this case, the 0.25%, I can speak in Australia mainly, they're taking up too much room for the amount that they have. People are over consuming. People are having these grandiose 4-bedroom houses when there's 2 people living there. And I think then on the other side, you've got a developing nation that has a 1-bedroom studio and there's 7 people in there. So I think before we look at, there's all this nature and there's this room, I think we have to really balance out the fact that these developed nations have people that live, like I live in a van. Like that is my home for now. And I take up much less space with my fiance than someone who has a 5-bedroom house. And I'm not saying that's a problem. I'm saying it's fine if you need it, but I don't want to be chopping down pristine nature just because some people have are living above their means. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I agree with that. It's also like they say the same people who say that like you cannot sacrifice pristine nature to host more people, especially from the demographics you don't like. They do not have any qualms when it comes to eviscerating same pristine nature for building some plants that are not going to be environmentally friendly and all that. So I completely agree with that. When it comes to the remark from Harari, I do not necessarily think that he actually provided something new in terms of the insights there, because a similar thing called the responsibility to protect concept was developed initially within the UN at the beginning of the century, and then was one of the key pillars of the reform of the UN that Kofi Annan, at the time, while being the Secretary General, tried to push. This went to nowhere, among other things, because of what happened with the invasion of Iraq. So this, to me, his argument senses the same vibe as from the responsibility to protect, and in the current very fractious climate of international relations, I do not see it anywhere coming further. However, I also am, when it comes to the explanation of migration processes, I am also a big fan of what Parag Khanna wrote in his most recent book called Move, where basically he is just stating what we should consider, in fact, the obvious, that being on the move is a fact of life that has been with the human population throughout its history of existence. What is different right now is first and foremost the drivers, because environmental migration as a driver, this is something that on the scale that we anticipate has not been present as a significant factor for quite a while. But we have seen this already panning out locally. Like, for example, the beginning of the civil war in Syria. It was predated by a very long, unprecedented drought that brought many villagers to the cities where there were no additional jobs. And at the same time, the Assad government was cutting those food subsidies that many people were relying on. So in fact, locally, we're already seeing it, but globally, we are not prepared for those flows. So I am more Team Hanna in this regard than Team Harari, because I think his approach and his descriptive approach at the same time contextualizes the problem better, and does not venture into the realm of speculating about solutions that the current highest forms of societal organization, namely the states, are not ready to implement due to lack of political will, not to the lack of instruments or anything.
Of course, yeah. Move sounds like a good next step in learning about this issue, because it is more than just Yuval's opinion. Of course, this is something that's very multifaceted in a lot of ways. But to finish up the conversation, Vlad, we kind of went everywhere. I wanted to give you the platform for a minute or two to speak your mind for a moment in the form of words of wisdom. I like to leave people with a platform, like I mentioned, to talk about something that they're passionate about, something they've been thinking about for the past 24 hours during this conversation, past week, year, month, whatever it may be. But I just wanted you to leave some last little nuggets for our audience here. So take it away, my friend.
Well, I'm not sure how good I am at dispensing wisdom, but I will give it a try. I know many of us, me included. My family is hosting 3 refugees right now, are at various degrees of despair in the times that we're experiencing, for various reasons. And oftentimes we might not have a very clear end in sight, or the end might be worse. Especially that also extends to the colleagues of mine who might experience eco-anxiety and those forms of worry about the future state of our planet. But one liberating thing that I have tried to exercise, even in my own work, is the sense of realistic control. of what we can control and what we can influence. And as it was written, I think, in one of the books by Leo Tolstoy, do what you must, and it shall be as it shall be. Make sure that you know exactly what you're able to influence in the topics that animate you the most. But do not waste your emotional energy on something that you cannot change, because it is a limited resource and you will need it elsewhere, especially for the things you love and care about.
I love that. In Australia, we have a bit of a saying, and it kind of speaks to that pretty well. And it's a saying by this a crook. I guess he was a bandit, and he's become infamous. Ned Kelly, if you've heard of him, and
No.
he kind of has this popular saying that's just such is life, and the way that we interpret it here is, you do what you do what you want, you do what you can, but at the end of the day, whether something good or bad happens, all you can say is such is life. Such is life.
And this is like sometimes the media climate tends to portray us as the worst people on earth for not being able to care about all horrible things that are happening at once and equally. And this is in fact only generates even more anxiety. It is okay to pick your battles, because what matters ultimately is the impact. And the best impact is achieved when you prioritize and pick your battles.
Yep, I love that. Well, look, Vlad, it's been an absolute pleasure to get to know you. There is a lot that we traveled through in this hour and a half or whatever it happened to be. I'm glad that your internet stayed and we can have this video so people can watch on YouTube and all the good things. I just want to finish up with a thank you. Of course, a thank you to you for coming on the show and speaking your mind. There's a lot of wisdom. You're very modest as a human being, so I really appreciate that. Look, I really appreciate the effort as well that you put into being a leader for the youth. Like I talked about, something I'm really passionate about is making sure us youth have a very powerful, clear, concise, and intellectual voice in these conversations around climate change, in these conversations about green jobs, about migration, something that will affect millions and billions of lives. So I really appreciate the fact that we have someone like you on our team who's having these really powerful conversations that can hopefully move legislation, make an impact that is positive. So look, mate, you're doing an incredible job with the work you're doing and the information you're spreading. So thank you very much, Vlad.
Thank you very much for the invitation, Tom. For our work, every platform is of a great value. Thank you so much.
Hi there. Welcome to the end of the episode. Thank you so much for listening and or watching the whole way through. I really appreciate you, every single one of you. I know that there's 100 million podcasts out there and you've taken the time to watch or listen to this one. So I'm super humbled by that. Thank you to Vlad once again for coming on and sharing this conversation. For any ways to connect with him, all the work he does, I'll leave linked in the show notes below. There is a lot I took out of this conversation, which I'm very excited to take into my life, especially on the political side of things. It really is empowering to know that you and we all have a choice every day, where our money goes, who we vote for. Hopefully, if you live in a democracy, who we vote for and how that impacts our life. That is a choice we make every single day, and we can fight for what we believe in, and we can fight to curb climate change and to really change this horrific trajectory that we're coming across. Because like Vlad said, the disappearance of a country like Samoa or Fiji, these small island nations in the South Pacific, it's going to be horrific for a lot of people, especially the people living there. But it might just be something that's on the news for a few weeks and then we move on, which is the scariest part about all this. So this conversation, and I don't usually share my takeaways at the end of the episode, but it's really given me a perspective of how grave of a situation it is and how we must really act now. Like, climate change is not something in the background, it's at the forefront of everything we're doing, which is why I'm ever more grateful for people like Vlad and the previous guests I've had on for fighting for something so impactful, and why I'm ever so grateful that you will take your time out of the day, like I mentioned earlier, to listen to this, because really it is an important, pressing issue. It really is. And the fact that you're taking time out of your day to learn about it, that gives me hope. And that's my hope, because I get asked all the time, why do you have hope? Or do you have hope? And a lot of times I don't, but situations and conversations like this give me hope, even though there was a lot of morbid talk in this episode. The fact that you're here listening and watching, that gives me hope. So that is a really nice way to finish this conversation. But until the next episode, stay happy, eat plants, peace.